Well, I'm Charlie, and I'm a DPhil student here. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Jon for this event, How the Web Should Work. It's a real pleasure to have Jon with us today. I spent the last 3 months suspended from the DPhil working with Jon at Demos in London, the think tank, where Jon is a fellow. And I was lucky enough to take part in this project with him. We've been co-authoring a paper, which will be coming out very soon, I think.
Week or two.
Basically very, very exciting. I won't try and spoil anything before we get into it. I'll let Jon do that, but I should introduce Jon first. So Jon is a fellow at Demos, as well as a political scientist and software designer. His research focuses on technology policy and democratic innovation. And as I mentioned, we worked on this project, How the Web Should Work, which is basically a series of technical, regulatory, and institutional interventions that together reimagine the very foundations of the internet. So it's an ambitious project, I think it's fair to say,
yeah.
But I think it has real legs. So we've already been shopping it around a bit at the Ada Lovelace, the Turing, the Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum, which is very hard to say. But this is one of our first public presentations. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Presentation will be about 20 minutes that Jon's going to give, and then we'll go into like a nice long Q&A session, because I'm sure you'll have lots of questions. If you are joining us online, please put Q&A questions in the box, and I'll moderate later. And if you're in the room, just raise your hand and make eye contact with me, and I'll pick who I like the most. So I just need to say, for your awareness, the event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. So it's lovely to have you with us, Jon. And yeah, very excited to hear what you've been up to.
Brilliant, thank you. It was a pleasure having Charlie at Demos. For those of you who don't know, Demos is described as Britain's leading cross-party think tank, but it turns out every think tank describes itself as Britain's leading. So we do a lot on technology. We're home to the Good Web project, home to CASM, Centre for the Analysis of Social Media. But for the last few years, my work's been focused on this question of how the web should work. And what we wanted to do, like some of you, I've been in plenty of discussions on plenty of panels where we talk in lofty terms about the kind of principles we want to see online, and everyone nods and then they go away. And in our interactions with policymakers, we realized there was no sort of point in the future that they were working towards. It was very reactive. And what we wanted to do was sort of hit both those things, come up with something very specific, quite detailed, quite technical, and paint a picture of where we could be so that could inform the immediate actions that policymakers take. And one way to think about this is in the way that I think about this is in sort of 5 to 10 years when my mum sits down in front of a computer to do something online, like what's happening, what's moving where, who's doing what. And so the fundamental point that we make, the kind of key argument that this all hinges on, is that for the most part, the internet is built on this foundation of personal information. So Charlie wrote an excellent section in the paper where he talks about the sort of origin of the password, which goes back to like the 1960s. And while the internet's gone from a tool for sharing academic papers to the way you apply for a mortgage and buy groceries, a lot of those conventions, a lot of those mechanisms have prevailed. So if you're shopping for something, you're typing in a 16-digit card number that a bank sent you on a piece of plastic, you're signing in with personal data, you're sharing 3 months bank statements with an accountant. So you've got on one level, the internet's moving lots of information around, but when it comes to personal information, we're still in this very static manual thing. And the basic argument there is that mode of interaction, that classic sort of server client, enter lots of information, can be replaced with a model that's built on the idea of trusted connections. So instead of having to ask a user for something, you can ask another organization for it. Now, this fits within a universe of ideas. Many of you will be familiar with the idea of a pod or a personal data store that you gather up all that data and you put it in in Tim Berners-Lee's view, a hard drive sort of under your desk, and you say, here it is, you can look at it. What we're going to describe, and I'm going to illustrate this for you in a sec, is a mechanism of essentially routing questions to the entity in your life that has it. Now, to do that, if you're going to make that transition, there are a few things you need to do. So I'm going to walk you through, this gets a little technical, but I'm going to walk you through what we're proposing here and what it would mean. Before I do that, just some broader context. We've had quite a lot of engagement with people like the Competition and Markets Authority and the Digital Markets Unit, who are interested in what a kind of pro-competitive intervention might look like. We've been talking to people like the FCA, who are curious as to what the sort of future of fraud prevention is going to look like. So the challenge that Charlie and I have had is taking this big idea, and it's big because we're looking at very fundamental things, and plugging it into the conversation. And that's sort of, when the paper publishes, that's kind of some more work that we've got to do, is engage with policymakers. And so if we do a good job at that, then this might be the sort of thing that starts coming into fruition, but it's ambitious, so who knows. So I'm going to walk you through this flow. This will illustrate what we're arguing, and then by all means ask the harshest question you can come up with, because if we can pick any holes in it at this stage, then we want to get it in the paper. So in this flow here, our user is interacting with an organization. That might be an online retailer, it might be a government department, essentially anything that you might be doing online. Now, today, this organization will ask you if it wants to take payment. It'll ask for payment details. If it wants to sign you in, it might ask for username and password. In our conception, this organization instead expresses its needs as very specific standardized requests that go to your device. Now, what your device's role becomes is essentially as a directory of the organizations already in your life. So when you first signed up to Hackney Council, they're added to this list as Hackney Council. When you've started a relationship with your bank, they're added to this list. Now, because in this model we are routing between existing organizations, a question comes up as to whether an organization has a legitimate request for something, or should legitimately be able to provide it. Now, today, if you're an organization making data available, you have to make that assessment yourself. So if in my capacity as a sort of startup founder, I want to access Facebook's API, I have to go through a Facebook developer program. If I want my if I want my software to interface with Apple, I have to go through their interface program. We're arguing that specifically within this system, there's a role for the state there, that a dedicated certification authority should certify organizations to make or respond to specific requests. So this wouldn't stop an organization doing anything it does today, but if it wanted to make one of these standardized requests or respond to one, it would have to be certified. And we certify airlines, we license banks. We think some of the same protections should be applied to our personal information. And what that would allow us to do is for then the device to query that authority and pull in the kind of things it needed, like public keys and endpoints. And that's sort of similar to the role the certification authority has in terms of HTTPS kind of encrypted communications online. So now you have a position where your device has a record of who has what and who is allowed to provide what, or who can legitimately respond to what. And that would allow your device to then match that incoming request to the logical respondent and present you with the option to consent. So currently, consent online is kind of a messy, fragmented, manipulative process where a company can say, like, here's a big green button saying, sure, let's do it, and a dark gray button saying, manage my preferences. And I have never clicked a manage my preferences button in my life. This is what we imagine that looking like. This is a very simple example of purchasing something online. You've got an organization making a request, you've got the requests they're making, and then you've got the organizations that can respond. But this framework would apply to buying a house, right? Mortgage provider, bank, estate agent. Everything we do online is pretty much can be served by moving information between different entities. And the argument here is that this is something that pops up at the OS level. The user they don't have to set this up. They're not redirected anywhere. They don't have to enter anything. They're not showing anything sensitive. So once we've consented to a request being forwarded, then that's exactly what our device does. It forwards that request on to the logical recipient. So if Org A has asked for payments, we've decided which entity in our life can respond to that, and that request has then been forwarded to our bank that can respond directly. Now, moving from a system in which requests are being routed to the logical respondent and away from a system in which we're having to enter lots of personal information that we've memorized allows you to do some really elegant things. It allows you to transition away from universal identifiers like email addresses entirely. So in this system, the way that org A and our device communicates, refers to us is one hexadecimal string. The way that our device in org C talks about us is another identifier, and the way these two is a third identifier. So if there's a data breach, then that doesn't feed into some dark web mass of information. It can't be referenced against other data. And then additionally, because you're doing this all automatically, you can substitute what's being asked for things like claims or tokens. So the token example would be, instead of org A asking for your 16-digit card number, org A asks for a one-time payment token that your bank generates and only org A can use. And when you keep in mind that something like, where did we land, so 750 million pounds per year of fraud is based on the misuse of card details, there's a significant financial incentive for a government to do something like this. And then if you're a business turning over 10 million a year, you're paying about £250,000 in card fees for every payment that comes in. And you're paying that because of the weakness of the credentials that you're exchanging and the need to then add protections on top of those. So there's a lot of sort of incentives aligning in the system. The second point is claims. If org A is a car rental company, right, today they ask for a photo of you, your date of birth, all this information about yourself, which you hand to sort of a 17-year-old in a booth in Sicily. In this model, that request for license confirmation that might include, are you over 25? Do you have less than 3 points? Can you drive a car? And because they get a response back from org C that says, that can simply say yes or no. So if we think about what we're proposing here from org A's point of view, I'm a business. I've asked for some things. Within a few seconds, I've got them back in a format that I'm anticipating, because these are all standardized requests. Safe in the knowledge that is the right respondent, that is a driving authority. It's not some Moldovan troll farm, and safe in the knowledge that the user's given their consent in a way that isn't game. It's standardized across providers and devices. And so the point to make here about the device, and the argument we make in the conclusion of the paper, is that there is precedent in law, in common carrier law, to treat your device as an essential part of your life, as a thoroughfare that should have a responsibility and can be legally compelled to route these requests, in the same way that a ferry operator is legally compelled to treat cargo, to not discriminate. And so we think this is a sort of proposal that would be mandated, but we make a fairly compelling argument that it's also in their economic interest. So the analogy here is if we think of the early days of the iPhone, there was no app store, right? Apple controlled exactly what went on the iPhone, and they made an economic decision that they should let a whole bunch of apps on, most of which they don't make any money from, because it would increase the utility of the device, which, guess what, it did, to the point where we now spend a small fortune on our iPhone. So we think that the way we'll interact online, the way the web will work in the future is along these lines, and our device will play a key role. But that'll be information that isn't owned by and controlled by a big tech company. It'll essentially be a protocol that is built into your OS, and the role of deciding who can access what will be decided nationally by certification authorities. The role of deciding what standards look like will be decided in a standards forum. We call it standards forum. The idea is you bring together existing standards bodies. And so when Charlie says this is an ambitious proposal, this is what he's referring to, right? We're arguing that our device should route requests. We're arguing that we need a new government body and we need a new standards operation. But the outcome for the user is going to be, we think, quite profound. Their experience online becomes just rooted in trust and privacy and protection. And what we do in the paper is we model this through identity, the ability of your device to then express a clear measure of your identity, because it now knows the number of connections and the frequency of connections. So it can say very authoritatively that you are a living, breathing human. The ability to then expand that definition of identity by forwarding requests for things. And then we look at what it would mean for advertising, which is, again, where things get really interesting. Currently, your advertisers are paying about 50 to 60% to the network of brokers that sit between an advertiser. And so it's something we're fond of and we've sort of gamed out, but I think probably a good time to hand over to questions. Was there anything you wanted to add, as you've had a hand in this?
Maybe we can talk more about standards later, but yeah, I would just emphasize that I think, like with a lot of the previous kind of revolutions we've seen in the internet, this is a kind of classic disintermediation argument, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where the people who may be upset by this proposal are the people that currently make up for the fact that the wiring of the internet is so rubbish and relies on people doing everything themselves, and these universal identifiers like you talked about that we duplicate everywhere.
Yeah, so MasterCard, Visa, Stripe, these are losers. They get their 2%.
They're going to hate
this. They're going to hate this. The ad exchanges, Experian, the credit reporting agencies, these are losers, but everyone else is a winner.
Yeah,
Government's a winner because in some cases, Org A, Org C, these might be government departments. There's a lot of questions that a government department could be able to answer. But for them to do that today involves them essentially building a kind of connect to Facebook style OAuth developer suite system. And you literally have to have like 20 million users to even be able to integrate that kind of thing. And so the conversation we had with the Digital Markets Unit, with the Competition Markets Authority, is how do you create a fair marketplace where if I've decided that I'm a customer of Yoti, this identity provider, when I go to sign in somewhere, do they pop up as my number one option, right? Because currently it's there's so much friction in terms of moving this information around. So and yeah, so in historical terms, we kind of couch this as the internet was created to do one thing. We've taken it in a very different direction and massively expanded it, a bit like Mrs. Armitage's bicycle. If you read that children's story. And now we need to update the kind of regulatory, technical, and institutional infrastructure that surrounds that, so that we don't have to rely on these giant companies to fill in the gaps. Show my driving license with Apple, pay with Apple, sign in with Apple, pay later with Apple. Yeah, so, but I'm obviously, like, I appreciate this is a tough sell if you're like a minister who has been reshuffled and is about to be reshuffled. But we've had a good response from the opposition, who may come into power and have some runway to do some interesting things. So yeah, any questions would be welcome.
Oh wow. Yeah, I'll take names, then we can go in order. So yeah, we'll work across. So Amanda, Clemmy.
Oh, why am I giving the spotlight first?
Yeah. we'll start there and then go on.
Right off the bat, thank you for sharing this with us. This is actually really exciting to see, and it's definitely something that I've never thought of before. So excited to see what comes out of this. I have a couple questions, but I'll start with one that just comes to mind because something that happened to me recently, and has raised like my kind of awareness of being too dependent on devices specifically. So my phone was stolen, and all of a sudden, because of two-factor authentication, I couldn't access my bank. I couldn't go onto my email. I couldn't access anything from work, and I had to go buy a new phone. But at that moment, I couldn't buy a new phone. So basically, I couldn't live my life for about a solid 2 weeks until someone lent me a phone and I could like get all this access from everyone. So I guess what's your sort of way to address like concerns around becoming maybe too reliant on devices in case something happens, like it's stolen, it breaks, or some other catastrophe happens?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's kind of the crux of it. I think for us, it's a balancing act. So it's a kind of it's mathematic. So are the benefits of transitioning away from personal information, passwords, emails, things that can be hacked and reused and sold and massively abused, does that outweigh the benefit of moving back? And we're not talking about a wallet here. This is not like, let's put all the data on the device. The device here is a very light directory that just points you in different directions. Now, what we're kind of also relying on here is the sort of auxiliary protections that the OS, the phone, the OS provider or the phone manufacturer has built. So account recovery, right? Like your ability to sort of back up this list or sync this list across devices. So the argument in the lost phone case would be that you should be able to go to a phone store, buy a new phone, sign into that phone, and the verification in that within that sphere to be strong enough that you've then reactivated all this. Now, maybe there are other checks that happen, right? Maybe because you've just reactivated a new phone, the phone has to ping a bunch of entities in your life and double check that you're you, right? So, but I think we'd like to get away from a system of two-factor authentication. And actually, when you think about it, your device with Face ID, with a GPS sensor, with all the other sort of subtle things that Apple do to make sure you're you, if it's going to be anywhere in your life, that's where you want it to be. So, but there's always going to be a point of vulnerability. It's about deciding what is that point of vulnerability. And we think it shouldn't be personal information, but it could be your device. But within a very structured, regulated sense. So Apple can't data mine this list and target ads at you based on it, right? There's, we've got a long history of internet regulations specifying what ISPs can do and can't do. And so there are a lot of sort of resources we can nod to for this position, this role.
I think it's worth saying as well that so a lot of the time when we explain this, people think we're just talking about like a new proprietary solution. So it's like sign with Apple or whatever. And we explicitly are trying to move away from that. It's a kind of unbranded universal system that would work across every OS provider, every manufacturer.
Yeah, so the point is no one kind of owns it. No one's taking their cut because the cost of building that software into the device is accommodated when you purchase your phone for £1 million. The cost of setting the standards is industry funded. It happens in existing standards bodies, and then the state is certifying. Now, keep in mind with this bit, every company handling personal data has to register with the ICO today, pay £40. So we're kind of already doing this anyway. You kind of already need to be certified. We just don't call it that. No one ever knows, so no one ever does it. So they just go around finding people £4,000. Like I advise a bunch of companies, and I'm constantly like, "Hey, register with the ICO," and they're like, "What's the ICO?" So I think we're closer than we think to this.
Funny.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I have like kind of 4 questions. Sorry, I don't want to be greedy, but yeah, I'll just say them and then like maybe we can move on to someone else and you can come back and answer them if you want. But yeah, that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. I guess my first point was actually kind of ticked off by Amanda. I was just wondering about, how you would handle if the device is the identifier, how you would handle people switching devices. But just to add another layer to that, I think what COVID really highlighted was the fact that a lot of people don't actually have access to like their own personal device. So I wonder how you would handle that with people who are like going to use internet cafes or like borrowing laptops to buy things and stuff like that. Obviously, you lose that flexibility with people who don't own devices themselves. The second question I wanted to ask was just a bit more broadly about like the incentives for this. Like I know you mentioned the economic incentives, but I guess I'm kind of also thinking about like if people are skeptical about switching over, like generally people hate change. So how would you kind of like incentivize the users to switch over to this and to feel like if they're handing all their information over to like this authority and B, these organizations who are then like responding for them, how do you kind of reassure them that their information is being like well taken care of and things like that? And also how do you kind of regulate the authority almost to make sure that their incentives, because their incentives are likely to also be economic?
Let me answer those ones and then
Sure.
we'll do the others.
Okay.
So I don't lose track, but thank you. The sort of future we imagine is that when you go to do something, there are 2 options. There's a big button that says do it. If you press that, then it triggers this pop-up and it routes off those requests. Beneath that's going to be another button that says do it manually. If you tap that, we don't see the personal data entry bit going away, but it's going to be a single-digit percentage of the population who are tapping that. But you might not like the do it button, so you might click the do it manually and then you're entering passwords and usernames. But we think we can shift a significant amount of user behavior into a system that is made up of pairwise identifiers, tokens, claims. It's massively protected. And you have more resources to direct towards protecting the users that do want to go to Internet Cafe and log in. There's some quite cool stuff you can do with this because you're routing between existing organizations, this just works. So you're not saying to a user like, go off and set this up. The button just appears and you click it. And then those connections are made. You can do some stuff with like hashing emails and sending hashed emails so that a company that you've previously signed in with an email can link that to an account. And because of the trust that you're baking in, there's some clever technical things you can do. What was the second question?
Incentives for users.
incentives for users. So in that instance, the difference between those two experiences, spend a longer amount of time giving more information, making yourself more vulnerable to get the same outcome. And we looked at data from when Facebook Connect was first introduced, right? That gave companies a way of saying, just give me this, sorry, log in with Facebook, give me this information directly. And in some cases, it led to like a 200% increase in usage of products because of that reduction in friction. And so if a user, if a user can understand that what they're doing is going to take them 2 seconds and they're going to click that button, and what's going to be released isn't going to be their personal data, and that is something that isn't owned by any company, then I think it becomes a very attractive proposition. But you shouldn't be forced into doing that, right? We're always going to provide you with the opportunity to go down a kind of manual route. Yeah.
So that, I think that answers the first bit of the question, which was for people who don't have a phone or a device, whatever.
Definitely.
And so on incentives, it's save time, operate in a far more private and risk-free manner.
Yeah.
Like I shop at Amazon a lot because I just can't be bothered to enter my card details on some random website to buy like a garden hose. And so that forces me towards a Monopoly player. If I can click a button, see a dialogue come up, know that retailer has been certified to receive payment, pick my bank, have that payment done in a way that isn't giving that retailer anything they can use for anything other than that one payment. Like that's, even if I don't know any of this, that's set up to attractive. I talked about the incentive for the org. They get what they need instantly without having to worry about asking for consent, without having to worry about whether it's coming from a legitimate source. The device manufacturer is creating a far more useful device for their users, right? And if Google do this and Apple don't do it, then that's a real incentive to switch OS provider. And then the provider of data, they like it because there's no kind of like Cambridge Analytica style story coming down the tracks where they've accidentally given lots of personal data to a Cambridge researcher. Good thing I'm not giving this talking Cambridge. Because they can say, and we see this happen with car rental companies, like when you turn up to a car rental company, they love that you've got a driving license and that the state has told them that you know how to drive a car, and that the liability is wrapped up in that through an obligation to have insurance. And so the sort of the fact that you've got this certification is very attractive, and means that, and like we think out of that come a whole bunch of applications that we can't even imagine here, where if you think about if you're an AI company and you develop a new method for assessing the risk of heart disease based on payment data, currently there's no regulatory framework. There's no like framework for doing that, right? It would be it's like a nightmare, a lot of manual stuff to do. In this, your AI companies would go to your standards authority, work out what they need. Like, where's that algorithm running? What are you requesting? Does it spit out a score? Standards body would agree on what that standardized request is. That org would then go to the certification authority and be like, hey, we're an AI company, we want to ask for sensitive information. Certification authority would set a very high threshold for that. They'd ask for like, maybe we need to audit you, maybe we need to do all sorts of stuff. A bit like the difference between being licensed to drive a scooter and drive a heavy goods vehicle. But then that company could say to a user, here is our thing. And the user can then, they'll be routed to NHS or the bank or whatever it is, and everything will sort of move around. So, yeah.
But thank you so much for the talk. I have two primary questions. The first one is about the process of creating this standardized set of requests.
Yeah.
Because from what I've heard so far, it's about like the proposed idea is of a forum structure, right? And assume a forum of big tech companies. So I'm wondering, like, is it really a shift from this dominance of big tech setting the standards to a bunch of big techs collectively?
Yeah, well, so it's a great question. So it's sort of sector by sector. So if we're talking about payments, then you're going to have banks, you're going to have building societies working out, what does a request for a payment token look like? And in finance, actually, a lot of this stuff already exists. And so the point of the forum wasn't to come up with the standard, but to be like the end point, the publication point that gathers it all together. And in the paper, we say that should have a civil society component. So it's the wrong analogy because I kind of hate the House of Lords, but a bit like the House of Lords. So you kind of have a bunch of think tanks, academic institutions, and they can say, hold on, that standard you're going to create, that's a bit intrusive. Like, you shouldn't be able to ask for, I don't know, sexual orientation or something.
Yeah, but is there any way for the users to be represented directly in the decision making then?
We'd like to think so. We think probably through that civil society mechanism. I mean, at Demos, we do a lot of citizen engagement, we do a lot of polling.
So the users will be represented through these kind of organizations.
So, well, keep in mind that whatever standard gets outputted, an organization that wants to use it has to be certified. And that there is an incentive, there is a kind of mechanism built in here where if companies come together and come up with a standard that's like way over the top, the certification authority can look at it and go, I'm not certifying you to do that.
Yeah, but in that case, the users are still like represented through the government body then, right? Like, I'm just wondering what because this is like the ideal scenario. So in this scenario, how are users exactly represented in the making?
It would, I think as it stands today, it would be through this civil society tier. So that's designed, Privacy International, Demos,
Okay.
whoever it is, whose job is to look at a request and go, does this serve some valuable purpose? An extension of that might be an obligation to run that through a citizen assembly or something. But this is a provocation paper, so there's a lot more
for
to
the
do.
clarification.
Yeah,
my
good
second
question.
is closely related with the first one, because you also make an economic argument, right, about reducing friction, basically, to improve efficiency and output. But there is also a counter argument could be made with regards to innovation, right? Because in this current structure, you're basically saying whoever gets onto the table can gain a massive advantage by reducing basically possibilities for comparative differences in the information that are requested for the types of services, right? Because so, for instance, if there is an emergent service or an emergent technology application, right, that would require a different set of requests or additional requests, the current structure would punish them by saying, this is the majority, like the set of requests, this is the majority, and this suits the market, 95% of the times. And I'm just wondering, because you propose it at the national level, and there is cross-national competition.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but in the standard setting forum,
Yes.
you might have a situation where there are two competing views for what a payment standard would look like, and part of the forum's job is to go, no, there's one.
Yeah, but the
Now,
case is
that doesn't negate another separate application coming along that needs another separate standard. But what you don't want is all C speaking one language and all their A speaking another. That doesn't mean there aren't potentially tens of thousands of standards that do all sorts of
but
things.
in a democratic representation setting, if there is an emergent application that hasn't really established itself, it would be at a disadvantage in the negotiation at the forum structure, right? Because by the nature of democratic process, they would be a minority. But in a cross-country competition setting, that would put an extra burden on the domestic innovators, right? When they're coming up with new types of services, then they might say, the regulation is working against us within this country that has a forum of existing big tech companies.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the point of reference for me is like a kind of W3C thing where you have we're all talking about what is this,
right.
What is the browser thing?
Right.
But we're talking about a language of requests. And I just don't think there's going to be that veto, at least we're talking prospectively here, but I just don't think there's going to be that veto opportunity, because the existing way of doing things will continue to exist. So the dominant players are using whatever standard they want. Some new interesting way of doing something comes along, then that comes up. But I think a direction to take this project would be to look at those the way of structuring those organizations. And as Charlie mentioned, another of my specialities at Demos is democratic innovation.
Yeah.
So, but that's another talk for another day.
That is another talk. We do have a question online before I go through my flow. I've been taking names of who's got hands up. So Steve Wood has asked, the UK Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, DPDI, currently before Parliament, contains new provisions on digital identity in a federated system with certification. In your view, how far does this help in providing the baseline to help make this work in the future?
Maybe you should answer this one.
I can try.
Yeah, give it a stab.
So I think what our kind of view is on digital identity is, I can't speak specifically for the DPDI as I've not read it in like massive detail, but I think our thing is this is partly an identity thing, but it's also far broader than that. So a key use case would definitely be identity. And as John mentioned, one of the nice things about using a system like this is the device can then start building up all these really unique identity kind of markers, signals, measures that you can't really get under current systems. So things like the number of connections that you have coming in and out of the device, like how often you normally log on to these things for, where you're doing it from, all of these kind of things that are kind of signals that you are who you say you are, would be kind of collected by the device, and it would have this amazing kind of view of the network, the constellation of things in your life and how they fit together.
Yeah, like a measure of your digital footprint, like the weight of your digital footprint. So if all it was logging was number of connections and frequency of connections, probably not where you are or who you're talking to or what you're saying, but and this kind of goes back to like a very traditional model of identity, where if you're in a village, you might go to the local blacksmith and he might say, oh yeah, Charlie's a great guy. He's not telling you everything he knows about Charlie, he's sort of vouching for him. And so again, this is where that trust, injecting that trust comes from. But on the identity point, there is a like fundamental philosophical departure here from how we think of identity and how we've traditionally thought of it. And traditionally we thought of identity as something you have in your pocket, right? An identity, show me your identity, a digital identity. In our view, there is no such thing as an identity. There are questions and there are answers. And any organization that needs anything to do with identity has a very specific question. It might be, can I take you to court if you don't pay this loan back? It might be, are you the only human being? Are you a one-of-a-kind human being? Are you a human being? Are you the human being I was dealing with before? There's myriad options, and you want to have a way of expressing those things that captures the essence of what's being asked for. Because, last time I rented a flat, they were like, send us 3 months worth of bank statements. It's like the amount of information I'm giving you is insane about me, all those Gales purchases. And actually what they need to know is, can I afford to rent this flat? And that could be a yes or no answer. And so I think we're putting forward a very different view of identity, which has been interesting for you in your PhD.
It has, yeah. Popping into London a few times a week on the train and kind of leaving behind the world of UK digital identity for this broader idea has been very, very fun. I would just add as well that, yeah, so I think in a way what we're saying is this kind of leapfrogs the kind of idea of federated identity providers.
Yeah.
There may well be a few specialist IDPs that exist in the market still.
Yeah.
But by and large, I think we don't see much of a role for that kind of, I'm going to collect all this information about someone, build a dossier and put it somewhere, whether it's in a federated database, a centralized database, a decentralized database, wherever it is. That's not the way we really want to do it. We want the data to stay where it is, and have a sort of uniform, standardized way of asking questions and answers to get it from where it is to the answer where it needs to be.
And that's like a fundamental, that's baked into what the internet is, right? Like we had libraries where we put all the information and we went to get the information. And the internet came along and it was like, you can now route at light speed between different computers. And now the debate, we're like walking backwards. We're like, okay, let's get a market of identity providers. This is going to turn into a rant, but what DCIT are doing with the trust framework is essentially like, let's have a market of identity providers. What those identity providers do, the first thing they do is give us your driving license. We're going to hit the DVLA API to check that's valid. And then we're going to build up a profile around that. And so it's like, just ask the DVLA if this person is a person and get back a yes. Don't like take the intermediary out, take the payment out, like we've got a state for a reason, and the answer that you inject a market into something will solve it. With something like identity that people just do not think of as a product or service that needs to be provided to them. It's innate, it's who I am, it's innately me. And the thing that I've brought to this work is coming from a software development background. It's like, this has to work seamlessly for the user. It has to work better than Apple Pay. Right? There can't be a cognitive load to do this. You should just click a button and it's like sign in and you've signed in. And you've signed in at a standard that far exceeds providing a username and a password or whatever it is. And so yeah, But as a result, I don't get included in all the DCIT
So yeah,
sessions.
Steve, I guess the thing to say is DPDI is probably not going to have the legislative teeth that we would need to do
Yeah,
this.
but
This
neither
was
does
the same thing.
neither does sort of a GDPR. Like, you know, we've got a lot of data protection legislation that's built up around how you protect a personal data rich system, right?
Mm.
If you move to a system in which organizations just aren't holding stuff that can be used for bad, right? If our online retailer here screws up, like, you could literally run this system in the open because a hacker can't pretend to be all gay because they've got their public key, which the device is pulled in from the authority. So it's like a sort of, foundational thing. Anyway, end of rant.
I think James, Oscar, well, one of you two negotiate.
I will follow the trend and go for 2 questions, if I may.
Yeah, shoot.
So question 1, I guess, is about the incentives on Alt-C, and I know that we touched on it, and I guess it felt like the elision, like you elided slightly and said car rental companies love it when you hand them a driving license because they get to ask these questions and have like yes and understand other things about you.
They don't have to work out whether you can drive a car. Is the point, right?
I guess my view is that Org-C is actually the DVLA.
Yeah.
And if you like look at the history of ask once policies across government, Estonia had a crack at it and like seemed to have made it work, and everyone else has basically found it impossible. Because
Tell us once works in the UK though.
fundamentally, as a sort of flow through in a couple of life events, but like fundamentally, no one wants to be a registry organization. Nobody wants to have responsibility and therefore liability if they're providing wrong information. If they haven't got your postcode quite correct, if they got like realized that you died and said that, like huge liability falls on them. And I'm not sure I see the incentives acting on the information providers. They'll just like, why would Org-C want to be the person or one of 2 or 3 organizations in your life that vouches for your address and has the responsibility of keeping that updated and correct? I think you'd struggle to find people on Org-C potentially.
So it breaks down in 2 ways. One, on the one hand, you've got the state, which have a legally endowed.
You tried asking government departments to give you information about people they know?
Well,
They'll just
in
say
the
no.
you've got a digital driving license in the works at DVLA, right? You think that's not going to be available through an API? It 100% is. So that will, in fact, that already exists. The question is more interesting when you think of a company, and I would point out that currently Facebook, Apple, Google, Amazon, the list goes on down to like crazy companies. These all have APIs that you can sign up to use, and there is an incentive there because that product then becomes more useful to the user, right? If to access Tinder with 1 click, I need a Facebook account. It's another reason to have a Facebook account, right? Now there is a data value there, right? That you're saying, okay, I'm learning something about a user through this from the information that they've given me, but baked into this unique identifier model is kind of the idea that data doesn't live anywhere you don't want it to. So the analogy I'd use for this is like the relationship I have with my local shops. Like I've built up relationships with the different shopkeepers in the different shops. And if I walk into one and they know something that I've told another one, then that gets weird, right? That's what feels creepy online, where you go to one site, you do something and you see that behavior reflected back to you on another site. And so what we're trying to do here is create a system that feels logical to the user, where if you want to create a connection between 2 servers held by 2 different companies, you have to go through this process. You have to ask the user.
But isn't your analogy actually your shopkeepers know stuff about you, and one shopkeeper takes on the responsibility of every time someone wants to know where you live? Instead of asking you, they come off the shop, hey, can you direct me to Charlie's house? And Charlie says, oh, he lives at number 4 Main Street. And they're like, actually, sorry, we've switched to the new like address framework, or actually, can you give me relational directions, or can you tell me how to get there from?
Well,
Charlie will eventually get sick of the request. Keep not getting value.
In relation to address, we think that's one that it kind of exists, but it kind of doesn't exist as like a logical interface. But it's something that we think the post office would be well positioned to do. So you move house, you change your address for the post office. That updates across everything that you've ever given your address to. Another one that doesn't exist but could would be you might have a new market entrant that builds up a record of your academic history, because realistically, primary schools aren't going to like be a node in this network. So there might be a scenario where you're sort of loading these things in, but from a commercial context, we see plenty of incentives to be a data provider. if I run a clothing company and I have 10 customers, but I know their exact clothing size, maybe I want to make that available as a response to a request, right? So now when I'm shopping online, all I see is clothes that are going to fit me. You know, the incentives fall out of line when you're talking about open data, and that's when it gets more tricky, right? If you're trying to apply a system like this to like climate data or medical data or something, but when you put the user in the loop, I'm going to choose a smart bank that can also do very accurate credit reporting if there's a choice there, right? Because I can get a bad credit score on Experian, or I can get a good credit score through my smart bank. So yeah, we see it adding up.
Fair enough for some of the higher level stuff. The fundamentals, I'm still not sure. I agree. The second question was about basically putting security into the hardware. And basically every hardware we've managed to produce eventually gets hacked. And a lot of the security we rely on in these systems, I'm so far from experts in this.
Yeah.
But like, as I understand it, a lot of the fact that we have either security in the cloud or in mainframes is because the devices are physically not in people's hands. And so it's that much harder to hack because actually I don't really understand the architecture that Barclays run in order to authenticate me. But like, if the security is actually being handled on device, and you can physically jailbreak or hack one of these devices such that you can start firing off fraudulent requests, and the type of device that you're relying on is widely spread, standard, has more power than any of the other authenticating devices before. I guess my question is about the incentives, and is that not the greatest incentive to physically hack a device?
It's a great question, but it goes back to the first question, which is about choosing your point of vulnerability. It's like, yeah, if you're a state actor, if you're like China, and maybe you can, you remember the FBI Apple showdown where they were like, they ended up finding a way around it, but that is a million miles away from how this works today, where I can just go on the dark web and probably buy everybody's payment details and then just start putting through fraudulent payments. It's like, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Now, on your device point, and we haven't modeled this out, but we will, let's say I hack it and I get the list, right? Now, what am I doing? What do I do? Okay, do I have to go up and create a company that can then make a payment request, right? Because in this, the response comes direct to the company, like, and they're going to send that to the endpoint. So I might pretend to be all gay, make a request for something, but I'm not going to get the response. I'm not going to get the one-time payment token. So there's complexity to the answer. It's like, it's not as straightforward as just like, you've got the list, therefore you've got complete control of everything.
You've got to convince the certification authority to certify you as a company. They're probably going to audit you if you're asking for like loads of people's money.
Yeah, and don't forget this footprint here. If your device is confident you're you because you've got 10 years of transactions with a cell provider, or you're making, your bank can testify that they have an 80% sure you're you because you've been making 10 payments a day for 10 years. For a criminal to mock that up, it essentially sets the bar so high that pretending to be someone is essentially impossible. Like you've got that weight, you've got that network of connections that can then be expressed as a measure. But it's like, that's where most of our cognitive energy is at the moment, because that's kind of the crux of it. But it's a rational, like, we are in this bad position now, and there is no, like, we think this is perfect in comparative terms, but like, of course, there are going to be scenarios where someone's list gets hacked and a state actor is able to pretend to be a legitimate organization and they ask for something, but it's a million miles away from where we are today.
I think we've got James, Vicky, Chris. Sorry, Oscar, sorry.
No worries at all. I'd love to explore having different economic agents as the user in that system, and whether there's any kind of key differences which you'd see playing out, rather than being a consumer, it's a business or an employer business or a government, and to offer one just to kind of, kickstart things. Is there a world in which, if you're a business user and you need to start disseminating authorization to make payments at various different organizations, you have multiple points of failure, and it could increase risk, for example. Appreciate we were just discussing the complexities about doing that, but I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we focus specifically on the individual with a device, with a relationship to that device, with that device in their pocket. So if you're expanding that to being a business, then I'd have to come back to you on it. what is it they say at Senate hearings? I'll get back to you on that, Senator.
Of course.
But again, ultimately, I think yes, you'll be a user within a business making a request. What that request does is find where the request goes is dependent on your network. But yeah, it's a more complex one. Not sure. Vicky.
Sure. It was really great to see this so fully developed. I think we had a long conversation
Yeah.
a while ago.
In its infancy then.
Yeah, it was good to see it here. So you talked about the ambition of this, and obviously a big part of that is getting policy buy-in. And I suppose I was just curious to get your views on what I would see as a couple of policy imperatives, one that would work very much towards something like this and one that would work against it. But the one that would work towards it, I think, would be the sort of pressures you see behind the online safety bill, the appropriate design code, the equivalent legislation in the EU, and also even now California, towards what people are now talking about as an age-aware internet. So the idea that you in order to enact many of these new sort of protective policies, you need to know, is somebody a child, for example, or not? And there's some really interesting conversations being had there, I think, about what you could do at the operating system level. So that to me seems to be, if you're not looking at those debates at the moment, that would be definitely one, I think your solution would probably also contribute a great deal. But the flip side of that, I think, is even in those same debates around, what types of policy are appropriate to protect citizens and users, is of course the response to the security agencies, which is to say, oh, you can have an encryption so long as we have a backdoor. And so I suppose I wondered, maybe particularly on that latter point, whether you thought actually there's a big risk there that actually this is so secure that actually, for example, those branches of government would not like
We
this.
thought a little about the security service one.
Okay.
And I think the point we'd make there is you want a world in which a legitimate entity, deemed legitimate in a democratic context, is able to do what they need to do, but a hacker isn't. And if your default is, let's just have a weak system so that we as a security agency can operate, and that's not a convincing argument. So the in for the security agency would be via the bank, it would be via the government authority, it would be, hey, what's your shared, here's a court order, give us your pairwise identifier with this organization. And they go to that organization and they say, hey, give us the data associated with this pairwise identifier. So the in is through the organization. And the great thing about that is those organizations can then act as they can assess whether that court order is legitimate, they can challenge it. We see this happening with social media companies, right? But obviously there's more framework needed on your child safety point. And this goes back to your point, like if there becomes a need to express a request for age, that is a demand. An entity that can express that will emerge. Now, I don't think that should be a whole new sector of companies that are like, hey kids, choose our product, we'll assess your age. I don't. But I think there are entities in your life, maybe it's the NHS, right, that has that endpoint and demand, supply. I think that pans out. But the one thing I will say, the hook that has been really working in this is that 40% of all crime today is fraud. And 80%, well, more than that, of that is based on crap identity and payment systems built on personal information. It's the fact that I can pretend to be Vicky Nash because I could probably work out when your birthday is, and I already have your email. I could probably brute force your password. Like that's feeding into this. And then if you think about all the models that underlie that fraud, right? Companies pretending to be someone they're not. I'm Amazon, you've missed the delivery, you better contact us, right? Or companies trying to make, or fraudulent actors trying to make payments. And that's the bit that pisses me off the most when I hear about friends of parents who've been scammed out of money, and like there's a responsibility on us as policy folks and on government to just like fix the system. And it's not about educating people to like, watch out for that errant text that they fall for. It's like, we could just update this stuff and then it's going to work. And the system we described, there's going to be instances where something doesn't line up, but for the most part, a system built on shared identifiers, on claims, on tokens, on certification, on routing, on standards is going to be like an order of magnitude more robust. And the kind of coolest thing for me, I've gone off Communion, is the idea that pretty much everything we do looks like this online. Like you go on a news site, right? You want to sign in, you want to pay for an article, this pops up at the side of your screen, right? You go on the local council site, you want to pay your council tax, this pops up, pay this, you click the button. Like everywhere you go, this is what we see it moving to. And this is just the amount of time it would save, the amount of assurance, the amount of sort of safety that you'd get. And if you didn't see this, then obviously that's a red flag. It's a bit like not seeing the padlock at the top of a website, right? like, oh, okay, I'm operating in a less secure fashion than I am now. And as a software designer, this is the bit I'm like, we can do this, then that's massive. That's 97% of the population being very happy that they can do all the things they want to do now quite easily. And
just on that point, on the kind of usability point, I think so it's maybe an anecdote. So compared with this, so some of the alternatives we have today are things like open banking, things like managing a digital wallet, which is one vision for the future. The open banking flow, I had to pay my Oxford fees the other day for Balliol, and so go on the Balliol website, press pay now. Balliol's my college, by the way, it's not Oxford. Press pay now. You get booted over to a payment provider, Paywise or something, that are going to manage it for you. You press pay with open banking, get redirected again. So this is the second redirect so far, to a Lloyds Bank website, which I've selected as my bank. I hope it is the real Lloyds Bank website. I then type in my email address and password, basically giving them all my login credentials. I get bounced back to Paywise, and they say, okay, we've connected with open banking now. Would you like to authorize a payment? Yes. Put me back to Lloyds Bank, type in the password again. It then says, yes, okay, we've now got your money and we'll hold it in escrow or whatever for 3 days and then pay Balliol.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, I accidentally paid my fees twice the other day. That exact confusing system. And I say that, normally I can use websites quite well, but it was very confusing.
Yeah, I was like, I studied digital identity. Like, I should be, and I'm basically just, as Jon said, looking at the padlock and saying, God, I hope this is like the right website. Like, I'm too busy to kind of, I shouldn't say that really publicly, should I? But yeah, so
the more usable alternative is the browser autofills your details, right? But then you're leaving that in the hands of the browser. That works half the time, or Apple Pay. And we can't sketch out a vision for the future that involves like one or two companies taking on all this stuff. Like we need to
installing them as the center of everything.
Expand that idea of openness and interoperability that is so elegant in the web's original conception. And to do that, we need institutional, regulatory, technical, need to just sort of expand that up to do all the stuff that we actually now use the web for, along with sharing academic papers, which we'll be doing in a couple of weeks.
And if the flip side is I manage a digital wallet, grab stuff from all over the internet, put it in one place, collate it together myself. If we're not going to let Apple take that on for us, and we're going to say, no, you need to do it as a user, is that a realistic vision for a large proportion of the population?
Well, that then really is a point of vulnerability, right? Because now I get into your personal data store, I access your trust or whatever it is. Now I've got everything in one place. And so there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to centralize all that information. And that's why the directory model, the idea of the routing, the sort of just internet version of personal information is fitting.
Chris, I think we probably have time for you.
I'll try to make it relatively quick.
Few questions.
No, just one question. Suppose I thought this was great. I love the idea of a sort of distributed environment where we operate via sort of hashed tokens. I think that's awesome. I don't have to use my identity. Why not take the next step and trust no one and not involve the government and just sort of have like a Web 3.0 kind of situation? My concern is this just the sort of license to rule them all? Can the government say to the opposition party, oh no, sorry, you can't be Orgay now? Maybe I trust the UK government, but the OS gets designed, it's out there, insert government you don't trust here. Now they're requiring that, I have this OS on my device. It is literally everything. They're denying licenses to organizations that don't agree with them. Why not just eliminate trust entirely? Then I don't have to trust that malfeasant government.
Well, that's worked brilliantly in crypto, right? No one's ever lost any money in crypto. No, like the key point here is this is what we do in banking. It's what we do in aviation. We certify airlines. If because there is risk, right? We license banks, and historically, if you look at the trajectory of banking pre and post licensing, you had banks going bankrupt left, right, and center. You had people keeping very little liquidity in banks because they knew there was a risk that would just go to nothing. 8,000 banks in the US or something crazy. Bring in banking legislation, it creates stability. Now we keep 99.9% of our liquidity in banks because we know those checks and balances are there. This is how modern society operates. I appreciate that in a country like, say, I don't know, Turkey, right? Maybe they're gonna push it, but it gets very hard to. It's enormously hard to build systems that are going to be allowed to run in countries that are going to be not fiddled with by those countries. When I was living in Turkey, I couldn't watch YouTube because they just blocked it. Right. So like
maybe I should rephrase my question.
Yeah.
Because I think maybe I was slightly more hyperbolic than I really meant to be.
So, second question.
Yeah, exactly. Second question. Do you imagine exceptions for licenses for politically sensitive organizations or organizations that fall below a certain threshold of revenue? You know, does your local shop really need to be involved in this?
Well, so your local shop is unlikely to be well, so I think the ICO point was kind of key there, that like the threshold for requesting payment, if what you get back is 2 random numbers, then that threshold is incredibly low. So that's the equivalent of doing your ICO licensing thing. But what you want to make sure is that the citizen walking into that shop to spend money has a level of confidence that they have when they get on an airline or when they put their money in the bank. And I think that doesn't exist today. And as a result, that has a negative effect on the way we use the web and the way we trust text messages that arrive on our phone and all these things that just eke away and ebb away at the kind of the way we operate and interact with people, and how on guard we need to be. And like it's a good question, and modeling it out in different political contexts would be an interesting exercise. But
fair enough.
Like there's precedent. Like, this is how we've managed a lot of sectors.
Maybe to wrap up, Steve Wilson has asked a question, which I think really nicely sort of points us towards the future. So I'll ask Steve's question and maybe we can wrap up. But yeah, Steve says, this inter-device Q&A protocol looks like a massive impact on organizations' back-end systems, databases, and customer management processes. Have we modeled the switching costs of doing all of this? And I would say potentially that's one of the things we want to do next is an economic, legislative, technical analysis that would dig far deeper into this. But
no, we haven't modeled it. But you can think of this in terms of currently this organization asks for things and it has to store those things. So when a user signs up, it asks for username and password. It has to store those in a server. In this version, it asks for things and it has to store those things, and it stores them in a server. So actually, it's just storing its unique shared identifier where it would have stored its username and password. And it's just storing its request token where it would have stored its card number. So no, it's not a big headache. There's work to do if you're a provider, right? Because you then have to be able to, you have to register with the authority, you have to have an endpoint, you have to be able to output that information. So not every organization is going to be a provider of information. That's like a business decision you make. Like, do we want to be a data provider? But yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
So I think, as you can see, big, exciting idea, touches on like every industry, basically.
Yeah.
And the good thing is there will be a provocation paper out very shortly that dives into much more detail.
Yeah.
So if anyone is interested, and we'd please encourage you to read the actual paper when it's out.
8,000 words.
Send us your comments, your thoughts, your questions, and we're looking forward to developing it a lot more. So I think if we can thank Jon, unless you have anything else to say.
No, thank you. Great questions. Some of which answers I might work into the paper at last minute. Frantic addition, but no, really grateful thanks for having me here, and thank you for Charlie for all your help on this.
Thank you for joining us on a lovely afternoon.